Okay.
Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett with the State University of New York at Geneseo and the International Yeats Society. And I'm here today talking with my friend Maureen Murphy. It's great to see you, Maureen. Maureen is a professor of retired from Hofstra, where she was professor of curriculum and teaching, director of secondary English, director of the Irish Studies minor. She was also a dean. She's the past president of the American Conference for Irish Studies. She has honorary degrees from SUNY and from NUI. And I know you, Maureen, from the Yeats the Yeats International Summer School, where we've met many times, and I know you were really involved with that throughout the years.
Yeah, and I just remember you as bringing wonderful students from Geneseo. They were absolutely super, and they came with you every couple of years, not every single year, but every couple of years.
Yeah, I think maybe 8 different groups over the years. We were canceled this summer because of COVID, but I'm hoping that in summer 2022 I'll have a group over there.
Well, they're wonderful students. They speak very well for Geneseo, and I say this is an old Cortland girl, and of course very well for yourself as well.
Thanks, Maureen. I was looking at my bookshelf, and one of the things that I saw on there was this book.
Oh yeah.
Which this is the first anthology of Irish literature that I ever owned, and I was an undergrad at the time, and I always think about it fondly. It's of course one that you edited, so I really. So I've kind of known you for a long time, and really at the start of my Irish studies career, even though we didn't meet until I think in the mid 90s, maybe late 90s. So what are you working on now?
What I'm working on now is the mission of Our Lady of the Rosary for the protection of Irish immigrant girls. Mm-hmm. About 300,000 girls came through the port of New York between 1883 and 1908. And those who were not met by family or friends, about a third of them, were looked after by the mission of Our Lady of the Rosary. They found jobs for about 12,000. And we have managed to digitize the records of 45,000. So I'd like to write about them. I have this mad idea. I'd like to do sort of family histories or self-studies, biographies of as many as possible. And that has kind of held me up, but that's what I'm working on. And then implicit in it is a biography of Charlotte Grace O'Brien, the daughter of William Smith O'Brien, whose idea it was to found the mission.
Huh.
So
that sounds fascinating.
It's been a very.
I saw. It's funny. I thought of you a couple of years ago. I was doing a class on the 1916 centenary, and I saw you in the New York Times. You were quoted a bit, and I knew you were doing a lot of work with on Irish immigration. So that sounds great. So we're going to talk about the Valley of the Black Pig from Yeats's 1899 collection, The Wind Among the Reeds. Why did you choose that particular poem to talk about?
Why I picked the poem is to have a look not only for the way that Yeats used some images, but for the way he explored his thinking about the Black Pig's Dyke itself. He dismisses the local belief, the local tradition that he had in fact collected about Pasternini's prophecy, and he fell back on a kind of an older mythology based on the work of St. John Rhys, the first professor of Celtic at Oxford. So I thought that would be interesting just to have a look at.
Well, that sounds good. Let's. I'm going to share my screen, and we have a number of images that you're going to comment on as well. So let me share my screen, and we will then talk about this.
Good.
And I need to start this slideshow over.
There we go.
This is I have it on ending the slideshow. Let me start it again. This is smooth technology at work here. There we go.
There we go.
All right.
Okay,
so if you could start by reading the poem for us.
Yeah, let me just gloss two words. You're going to see a word cromlech, and you're going to see a word cairn. Now, cromlech is really a Welsh word. We would use in Irish, we would use about Ireland, we'd use the word dolmen, but it's the uprights with the pillar stone on the top. And probably the best known one is in Clare and Pone na Brone. The locals sometimes call it Labba Diarmid Isgrania, the bed of Diarmid and Grania, that they slept on that bed while they were on their traipse around Ireland. But anyhow, it's a very important word, but as dolmen rather than cromlech. Cromlech is the Welsh or the Cornish word. Cairn, on the other hand, is a man-made pile of stone. And of course, we are familiar with the cairn because of the cairn of Maves on the summit of Knocknarea. And Yeats calls it a cairn, the grey cairn on the hill, which of course would be probably the hill on Knocknarea. But what it is it's a man-made pile of stone that sits above Passage Grave. If you're tooling around Sligo, you might go to Carrowkeel or Carrowmore or Carrowkeel, and they've got passage graves as well there. So let me read the text to you. The dew drops slowly, and the dreams gather. Unknown spears suddenly hurtle before my dream awakened eyes. And the clash of fallen horsemen and the cries of unknown perishing armies beat about my ears. We who still labor by the cromlech on the shore, the grey cairn on the hill, when day sinks down, drowned in dew, being weary of the world's empires, bow down to you, master of the still stars and the flaming door. Just to say, apropos of, because we don't have the, we're starting with the poem itself from the Wind Among the Reeds. But Yeats sort of started with this. In the early 1890s, Maud Gunn brought Yeats a manuscript book from Paris. And Yeats kind of jotted down bits of poems in that manuscript book. And he did his first version of the Valley of the Black Pig this way, up vertically rather than horizontally in the thing. And one of the thing, if I had the Cornell Yeats to show you his early version, you'd see that he doesn't make many changes. He makes small changes, but he keeps the single 8-line stanza and he keeps the rhyme scheme just the same. And this poem he published first in the Savoy in 1896. Now the Savoy, as you know, was a literary periodical. It was literature. It was the arts and criticism, because there are drawings there as well. And that was the first place it appeared. And then, of course, it appeared in The Wind Among the Reeds in 1899, as you see in the slide there. And it's not the most memorable poem in the collection. I mean, think of poems like The Hosting of the She, The Host of the Air, the Song of the Wandering Angus, the Fiddler of Dooney, even. So that there are lots of more important poems. But the volume as a whole is what was called a watershed book. Dick Ellman said in Wind Among the Reeds, it set Yeats's methods for the mode of the modern movement. So I think this is, as I said before, I think the poem is worth a look, not only for the way that Yeats used some of the images, but it reveals his thinking about this Black Pig tradition. Now, before I go into the poem itself, just have a look at line 7. And line 7, which talks about being weary of the world's empires, bow down to you. Now, this is a kind of, this is a male you in this poem, but I think it anticipates the female you in Red Hanrahan's Song About Ireland, which is in the next volume, the 19th, in the Seven Woods, where he says, but we have all bent low and kissed the white feet of Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan. And I'll have more to say about that later on.
I think too that whole weariness too is typical of The Wind Among the Reeds, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, that's such that volume, reading that volume, especially in the early version of it, or the first 1899 version before he revised. I find in working with students that it's really important to read a lot of the poems, and it just gets you into that kind of mood, that mood of being at the end of the century, and that sort of world weariness that we have.
Yes. As we well know, the world weariness, yes.
Yeah.
Now, the title, The Valley of the Black Pig, reflects or refers to the ancient Valley of the Black Pig, an earthen rampart which the 19th century antiquarian John O'Donovan believed was the boundary of ancient Meath. Now, later scholars have argued that the ramparts of this Black Pig's Dyke goes east to west from Dundalk, west through Meath and Westmeath, and they say that it was a barrier against the cattle raiders coming up from the south and challenging the kingdom of Ulster. And of course, Irish literature, early Irish literature, is full of cattle raids and rustling. I mean, they were great cattle rustlers, that crowd. A tradition associated with the Black Pig Dyke that's told through the region describes an enchanted pig who ran through the countryside, rooting up the earth. And the Irish Folklore Commission in the 1950s, the late 1950s, collected a story from a man in County Leitrim who challenged, he talks about a man challenging a teacher. The school teacher was turning his students into various forms. So the papa came in and saw the schoolmaster and said, you change yourself into the shape of a pig. And he did change himself into the shape of a pig. And he ran to the countryside, tearing up the land, and he went to Tellahan, that little tiny bit of Leitrim between Donegal and Sligo. It's just a little bit there. But ran through Tellahan, went into the sea and drowned himself in the sea. But let me go back to what Yeats said about the Valley of the Black Pig in the Savoy. He put a note after the poem in that periodical, the Savoy, in April of 1896. And he said, all over Ireland, there are prophecies. Now, I'm going to argue that Yeats ignores the prophecies, especially the prophecy of the coming root of enemies of Ireland in a certain Valley of the Black Pig. And these prophecies are no doubt, as they were in Fenian days, a political force. I've heard of a man who would not give any money to the landlady because the battle would not be until the close of the century. But as a rule, periods of trouble bring prophecies of its coming. And Yeats went on to say, a few years before my time, an old man who lived in Lissadell and a man in Sligo told me it would be such a great battle that the horses would be bloody up to their fetlocks, and that when it's over, that the saddles would be stuck to the horses because there was nobody around to unleash unbuckle them. Now, Yeats finishes that note, and this is where he is at odds, I think, with tradition. He finishes that note saying that Sir James, he says, if one reads Sir John Rhys's Celtic Heathendom, and Sir John Rhys was the first professor of Celtic at Oxford, he's a fellow of Jesus College. If you read the Celtic Heathendom with Sir James Fraser's Golden Bough, and put together what one finds about the boar that killed Diarmid and on Ben Bulben, and here we have Ben Bulben here at the next slide there. And what Yeats thinks is that reading it this way, it must be a type of cold and winter doing battle with summer. Not a political battle, but this kind of mythological battle. Yeah. And I'll get to that later on. So later on, Yeats reports, and may I have the next slide, please, that's at the Celtic Twilight. It's from the Celtic Twilight. And the next slide is the piece called War. That's right there. And he said he collected lore about the Black Pig from a very poor woman in Sligo. He said, presently our talk of war with France shifted, and as it had a way of doing, to the Black Pig, which seemed to her to be a battle between Ireland and England. But to me, says Yeats, an Armageddon which will quench all things, or quench rather, all things in ancestral darkness. So that's what. So what I'm thinking about is, did Sir John Rhys's book Celtic Heathendom, which were based on his 1886 Hibbert Lectures, did these inform Yeats's thinking? In other words, was it Rhys's work that caused Yeats to ignore the Black Pig Dyke in local tradition, which he collected rather often, for an earlier, more cosmic mythology? Mm-hmm. And just jump to the end, because I said that actually Yeats continued to think. I'll show you some of the intermediate things of A.E.'s piece, for example. But Yeats continued to think about this primitive energy, and in one of his latest sonnets, Muru, a sonnet in the late volume, A Full Moon in March, 1935, line 5 of that poem refers to the mythology of the Black Pig. He says, ravening, raging, and uprooting that he may come into the desolation of reality. That uprooting comes again. Of course, uprooting comes from the folk description of rooting up the earth. Ravening, by the way, is not a verb, but it's really an adjective, and it says somebody who's excessively greedy. Our friend Helen Bendler, in her study of Yeats's lyrics, Our Secret Discipline, she said the valedictory sonnet Meru contrasts the Western tragic worldview of successive self-destructive past civilizations with the detached Eastern. But anyway, I just think it's a kind of interesting that he continues to think about this myth even into the 1930s. As I say, like Valley of the Black Pig, this poem appears to be a single stanza. However, it's a Shakespearean sonnet, so it's longer, but it is the single stanza. And he wrote it as late as 1933, 1934. But again, he keeps to his theory that it's a battle between winter and summer, with perhaps a nod to that mythological pig that killed Diarmid on Ben Bulben. Now, Yeats chose to ignore the traditional myth of the Black Pig as an aspect of Ireland's enabling myth. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean the myth of the restoration of the rightful kingdom. Its mode is always violent. Its vision is always apocalyptic, rather. And in his general introduction to The Field Day, Seamus Dean describes that myth. He says, nationalism even found a way of converting every past failure and defeat into a proof of the indomitable spirit of the Gael as a warrant of further success. So nationalist songs like that of the 19th century poet Thomas Davis, for example, his poem, The West's Awake, written on the occasion of the failed rebellion of 1798, appears in The Nation in 1843, and it is even today considered a Galway national anthem. But it describes the slumbering connaught. It mentions places of traditional defeat like Aughrim before the last stanza. And of course, the last stanza is, but hark a voice like thunder speak, the West's awake, the West's awake, sing, oh, hurrah, let England quake, we'll watch to death for Erin's sake. This enabling myth is associated with the myth of the Black Pig, which is associated with the prophecy of Columkill, also known as Pastorinini's prophecy, which Yeats knew. And the prophecy, it's a prophecy that predicted an Armageddon in the Valley of the Black Pig that would bring a final triumph of the Gael over the Gaul. In other words, the Irish over the English conquerors. And it is they're kind of millenarian prophecies, circulate in the Irish countryside, and they tell the people to be aware of the signs that are coming that will herald this final battle that will be played out in the Valley of the Black Pig. And what would it be? It would be, for example, one of the signs would be a red-headed miller with two thumbs on his right hand. The sighting of this is the citing that the prophecy of Columkill will happen. And we might say that I always think, I did my dissertation on the Battle of Ballinamuck, the 1798 tradition in Ballinamuck, and I keep thinking it's very tempting to think that local people in North Longford may have thought that this prophecy was fulfilled when the French and the Irish came into Ballinamuck, the town at the ford of the Pig, on the 8th day of the 9th month, 1798. 8 and 9 are very important in the prophecy. And for good measure, it was also the feast of the Blessed Virgin. So they
Of course it was.
Oh, so couldn't beat it at that. Now, one can also establish that the prophecy was well known in the district because Maria Edgeworth wrote to her stepbrother on New Year's Day in 1798, and she said, "It's so dark here, I can hardly see to write, and it has been pouring since such torrents of rain and hail and snow that I have to think with John Mangan." Now, John Mangan was her model for Thady Quirk in Castle Rackrent, that the old prophecy found in a bog were all accomplished, and Slieve Lawtree was beginning to set out on its proposed journey to destroy Edgeworth Town. Now, even after the defeat of the Battle of Ballinamuck, the prophecy tradition was still a very, very vital part of rural Irish tradition. And Yeats knew it because the 19th century writer William Carleton, we'll just show the next picture of William Carleton. I think he's goes on.
I've got him here.
There he is.
There you go.
William Carleton. He says he wrote in the opening lines of the story called Tubber Derrig, and Tubber is well and Derrig is red.
Yeah.
And it's a story that Yeats actually included in his volume called Stories from Carleton. And what Carleton said is there have been for centuries, probably since the Reformation itself, certain opinions floating among the lower classes in Ireland, all tending to prepare them for some great change in their favor, of their enemies and their exaltation of themselves and their religion. And Yeats also knew this because he also did a book called Representative Irish Tales in 1891, and he included the work of John and Michael Banham, the Kilkenny brothers. They were the first Anglo-Irish writers who were actually Irish and not English. But he talked about, they talk about in their book, this prophecy and the coming of the prophecy. Yeats demonstrated his knowledge of the prophecy in an 1888 letter to Father Matthew Russell, a Jesuit editor of the Irish Monthly, who published some of Yeats's very early poems in 1886 and 1887. And he wrote to Father Matthew Russell, and when he was apparently working on Irish fairy and folk tales, because he said, "I'm anxious to have a section on the Irish saints and wish to give the prophecy of Columkill. The peasantry know them well." Of course, so does Yeats, because he gets them from the peasantry. There was a book published some years ago in Dublin, I'm told, that contains them. Do you know anything about it? And he's thinking about Nicholas O'Carney's The Prophecy of Columkill, published in Ireland in 1856, and then published actually in New York by Sadleir in 1861. So gets out to New York, and I'll mention the Irish-American connection in just a moment. Yeats, at the end of things, having written to Father Matthew about it, he didn't include the prophecy of Columkill in his story section. But the following year, he wrote again to Father Matthew, and he said that he was planning to do Irish representative tales. Mm-hmm. And he said, "I think it's a kind of social history." And that, again, suggests that he might look at the prophecy, though he doesn't mention it, even though writers like Carleton and the Banham brothers wrote about the folk belief. But he continued to be intrigued, and we'll just look at this next slide, please. Just there.
Is this the letter?
Yeah, this is the letter.
Okay.
And this is a letter which Roy Foster has in the first volume of his Yeats biography. Mm-hmm. It's written in November of 1897 by A.E. by George Russell that satirizes Yeats's preoccupation with the apocalyptic prophecy. He said he fondles it, the black pig, as a lover, the sweetest in his heart glances at his girl. I believe in dreams he tucks the weird animal under his arm and roams through the vast countryside. And there you can see just bits of it there.
Yeah.
As you
It's a bad sign when AE is kind of satirizing you for being too esoteric and apocalyptic.
And for those of you who don't know AE, the next slide will show you. This is they're at Cool and they're fishing. So it's AE and Yeats behind him, and at the very back of the boat is John Millington Synge.
Yeah.
A crazy a group. But as I say, he said, I foresee Yeats and his black pig in many a ballad and tale. Now, this prophecy appears not only in the English language, but in the Irish language. And may I go to the next slide, please? The next two, actually. Yeah, no, that's great.
You want this one?
No, just back one and back one from there. Just go back. That's it. Perfect. Okay. And the prophecy tradition in the Irish language also is linked with the prophecy of Columkill in the year of the 8 and the 9. Yeats's great friend Douglas Hyde quoted a stanza from Raftery, and here's Raftery. He's holding a violin. Raftery was born in County Mayo. He had smallpox as a boy, which left him blind, and his landlady said if he would learn to play the fiddle, he could kind of make a living. He apparently never learned to play the fiddle. He was a terrible musician. But anyway, here's a photograph of the statue of Raftery.
Where is that, Maureen?
It's in County Galway. It's near, it's kind of near where Raftery is buried. Of course, that marker has just the word Raftery, was bought and paid for by Lady Gregory, but this was put up later on, and it's just off the main road to Galway, and so there's a drawing to the right of Galway, and you can see perhaps the blindness a little bit better there. Now, Lady Gregory collected the songs of Raftery in that area. Raftery walked around in that Clare Galway area. And Lady Gregory collected a lot of the songs of Raftery, but she gave them to Hyde, and Hyde published them as in a book called Oran Atá Laga Ar Raftery, the poems or songs that are ascribed to Raftery. And if we look at this next slide here, and that's it right here, just the bottom footnote there. This is a footnote to a poem about the magic dates of the 8 and the 9, and this is the note that says, "Nur acalas an laur an yart, agus bohan ar brack a free, genva an classical bin hither an hof agus knee. When the lion shall lose his strength, and the speckled thistle its vigor, the harp shall pay sweetly between the year of the 8 and the 9. So you can see that little footnote there. That's what he also used the allusion to the prophecy in his poem Bua O'Connell, O'Connell's Victory, about another year of the 9, and this is 1829, not 1798, but 1829. And this was the year of the parliamentary elections in County Clare that saw Daniel O'Connell return to Westminster and beating William Vesey Fitzgerald, who was, by the way, who supported Catholic rights, but of course O'Connell beat him at the election. And in his introduction to the poem, Hyde speaks of the song made by a man called Oliver O'Curry to the air of Sheila Maguire. Now, Sheila Maguire would be an allegorical name for Ireland. Mm-hmm. The song includes this verse, and this is the way it translates. Vesey Fitzgerald, despised and overthrown, and Daniel O'Connell in love and pride, and wedded in beauty with you, Sheila Maguire. So this Raftery allusion refers to another aspect of the restoration of the rightful kingdom, the aspect that restores a woman to her youth for the love of a rightful mate. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And now, in his essay, Women in Irish Mythology, the late Celtic scholar with chair of Celtic Studies at Harvard, Princess McCanna, spoke of this phenomenon, very important essay. He said, in Irish tradition, it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the idea of the land and its sovereignty conceived in the fortune, in the fortune of a woman. From the beginning of history and before, until the final dissolution of the old Irish social order in the 17th century, that would be the Kinsale in 1603, traditional Orthodox thought was dominated by the image of the puella senilis, the woman literally old as the hills, yet endlessly restored to youth through her union with a rightful mate. And of course, you think of Kathleen the Houlihan.
Yeah.
Now, James Pethica has demonstrated with textual evidence that Lady Gregory actually wrote Kathleen the Houlihan. He says he found her handwriting, the play, and she has all of this mine. That the play was written by Lady Gregory, and the first of the series of the play for the Irish National Theatre Company. Now, here again, when is it set? It's set in the French invasion of Killala in 1798, and the play begins with the sighting of an old woman going down the path, and the younger son of the household says, "Do you remember Winnie of the Cross saying the other night about a strange woman that goes around the country whenever there's a war or trouble coming?" And of course, as you know, the old woman comes to the house. She appeals to Michael, the putative groom, who abandons his fiancée, who follows her. And as he leaves with her. And Peter, the Michael's father, asks Patrick, the younger son, "Did you see an old woman going down the path?" And he replies with the answer found in McCanna's explanation, "I did not, but I saw a young girl, and she had the walk of a queen." So you have the prophecy with its connection to the Black Pig Dyke and to the signs foretelling the fulfillment of the prophecy continued through the 20th century. In 1918, the year of the World War I armistice, the growing strength of Sinn Féin, the Roscommon Messenger ran a story online about the Black Pig of Kiltruscan. Now, the Irish Times, the very Anglo-Irish Times, reported the same story in 1918 and reported the fact that this pig was only visible to children, and that great crowds of people were going to the site where the alleged pig was allegedly sold. And I remember that Maura MacNeil told me that when she was a schoolgirl at Muckross, the Dominican school in Black Rock, around 1918, 1919, 1920, and through there, those sightings were commonplace. So in 1956, it goes on. In 1956, the Longford collector for the Irish Folklore Commission said there was still regard for the prophecy, even in the mid-20th century. He talks about an informant called John Mulligan, whose boast was that he had a copy of the Columkill prophecy. And Delaney said when he would interview other people in North Longford, they'd say, "Do you know that he has a copy of the Columkill prophecy?" In the 1970s, by the way, the Irish American Echo said to people, because they were writing in the 1960s rather, people were writing in to get copies of the prophecy. And the Irish American Echo said, "We're out of copies. We don't have any copies. They're not available. Try the bookstores along 7th Avenue." And by the way, what was Yeats doing? I thought, what was Yeats doing in 1917, 1918? He was courting Georgie Hyde Lee. That's what he was doing. He was in England. He really wasn't around. But in the 1970s, it was possible to purchase not only a copy of the prophecy from a card table in the Port Authority bus station, but also the provisional IRA bulletins, which were verboten in Ireland. So that's where you could go there as well. Now, the next is John Montagu. You'll see him right here. And John Montagu in 1964 said he published the third section of a book about his travels from Cork, where he was living, to County Tyrone for his mother's funeral. And he talks about having to cross the earthwork of Anger on the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
That's the collection, the Dead Kingdom, right?
That's right, the Dead Kingdom, exactly. And that's that's just 100 years ago. It's just amazing. And this section, this is the Black Pig, and then the very last poem in that series, called Wintry Dawn, open and close the section, and they talk about the tragic continuity of community strife in the North by he talks about here, the Black Pig's Dyke as an ancient frontier in Ulster, our bloody border, with the traditional coverage of the Black Pig, image of the Black Pig tearing up the land, involved with the lonely, fearsome creature furrowing a trough, again, ravening. So the poet remembers seeing a wild boar in Britain that reminded him of this. And the last and seventh poem, Wintering Dawn, again, he brings the boar, not tearing up the land, but slaying Diarmid on Ben Bulben. And when Fionn, remember, he has the healing waters in his hand, but he allows them to spill from his palm 3 times. And the final line, give a nod to Yeats's grave, over which the words "Britain go home" allude to the prophecy of Columcille. And we saw them there one summer in Sligo. Now, the myth, just the last slide I have, is of Vincent Woods. And the myth continued to evoke a strong response. In 1962, there's Vincent himself, Vincent Wood, wrote a mummers play called At the Black Pig's Dyke, which made its debut at the Druid Theatre in Galway in 1992. And it was a play around boundary violence, again, that Black Pig Rampart, based on the memory and myth that Woods would have known from his youth in Northwest Limerick. And I've been talking about Limerick and North Wallingford in this conversation. And it's a myth here. This play is a myth of bilingualism, folklore, and political history that Woods heard in his youth when his stories were told at the end of the tradition. I'm just going to take a quick sip. At the end of the tradition. And Woods added to the story that he got the mumming tradition that he got from Henry Glassey's work, All Silver and No Brass, an Irish celebration of mumming, and from Alan Gailey's book on Irish folk drama. And for Woods, the Black Pig was trapped in the underground as myth is trapped in the landscape in the Valley of the Black Pig and the fortification of the Ulster border. Now, the power of Woods's play comes from, it's a very theatrical play. And when it was produced in Derry in 1993, a young Republican protest group dressed as mummers and took the stage, and they rejected what they considered the play's naivete. They said that Woods was completely naive about this, and that the people recognized the story as their own. This is our story, not the playwright's story. So in addressing his poem, The Valley of the Black Pig, I think I'm just asking if Yeats failed to recognize the people's tradition. Did he choose instead to make a connection between the Valley of the Black Pig and the earlier myth, the struggle between summer and winter, or the struggle as it is celebrated in rural Ireland? A sort of combination of this is Maura MacNeil's Festival of Lunasa, where she talks about the long-standing tradition of meetings at heights and at holy wells to celebrate the victory of Lu, the god of light, over his dark opponent, Crom Dubh. There.
That's fantastic, Maureen. I was curious as you were talking. Well, one thing it's amazing to see that consistency of the Black Pig myth and its reappropriation. And I knew about some of those references, but I certainly didn't know all of them. And this continual reemergence and the desire to find confirmation in the signs and the need to consistently adapt it, and a way in which it's a useful myth for turning failure into a kind of anticipation of victory.
Exactly. How can you have all 700 years of defeat without having that kind of myth of the restoration of the right?
Of restoration, and I mean that's the Yeats and Gregory play, Kathleen de Houlihan. That is the it's the quintessential version of that.
Good example of that. Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's interesting when reading this poem, In the Wind Among the Reeds, where there are so many references to the seasons. And I think that seasonal battle that you're reading of Yeats is sort of turning away from these, these myths that aspects of the myths that he really knew well, and to focus on this kind of seasonal battle makes a lot of sense to me.
And remember that when I talked about Laura MacNeil's Festival of Lunasa, the fight between Lunasa and Crom Dubh,
that's exactly right. Yeah.
It's the 1st of August. Lunasa is the Irish for the month of August. The first Sunday in August or the last Sunday in July is the traditional date of that folk folk gathering to celebrate that battle. So Yeats doesn't look at that, but you have both things going on.
I wanted to ask you, maybe as a way of closing our conversation, about the tone of the poem. And it's interesting, seeing that it was striking when you're talking about Meru and the sort of continuity, and that poem, the line, "The desolation of reality," is always the line that's so powerful in Yeats. I think that's a really underappreciated poem, and I'm always struck by that.
Underappreciated. I was very glad to read Helen on that. Because it was very, very helpful. And wasn't it Clark who wrote a book, Yeats in the Theater of Desolate Reality?
Yes.
And he was kind of desolate reality. So
I'm wondering, about the tone in this early poem. There seems to be, again, that kind of world weariness that's so typical of the poems in The Wind Among the Reeds, but there's also a bit of excitement about this kind of apocalyptic clash, and the tone has a different resonance than when we take it out of that kind of political, a kind of basic sort of political reading, and into this more kind of seasonal or broader mythic context. So I'm just wondering what you thought of the tone.
Well, I just think, again, Yeats chooses to look at the older myth. But that's there in Irish tradition as well. He chooses to look at the older myth, but he doesn't grab onto the Lunasa tradition,
right.
which would have probably helped him with that, instead of ignoring the black pig, which of course he heard about all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good way of wrapping up.
Good.
I think it's been a lot of fun to talk to you. It's a cold January day, and so it's really fun to get a chance to see you and to talk about some Yeats poetry.
Yeah, it was marvelous. I really enjoyed it, Rob. I've been thinking about this poem for years and years, and I was glad to have a chance to really think about it and put some ideas together.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate you doing this. It's
my pleasure.
It's been fun to talk to you. So, okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oops.